Halo, selamat siang. Halo Pak Henk. Ya. Mas Farabi Fakih sudah masuk ya?
Sudah masuk saya.
Oke, ya. Kemudian kita masih menunggu Bu Amalinda dan Mas Abdul Wahid. Mungkin kita menunggu sebentar lagi. Dan terima kasih untuk semua teman-teman yang sudah bergabung di acara History Talk, buku presentasi buku dari Mas Farabi Fakih. Sudah ada sekitar 71 orang yang hadir. Terima kasih semuanya. Dan kemudian yang di YouTube sudah siap ya? Bisa dibagi YouTube-nya. Ada berapa orang? Oke, yang ikut di YouTube ada 15 orang untuk sementara. Lumayan banyak.
Saya sampaikan
Oke, selamat siang semuanya. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Mungkin sambil menunggu dari kehadiran Ibu Amalinda dan Mas Wahid sedang login, kita akan memulai acaranya. So, good afternoon for all participants and speakers in Indonesia. And as I saw, there are, of course, there is Pak Henk and some participants from the Netherlands and also Germany. I would like also to greet them good morning there. And then thank you all for joining our book review session today. And I'm very delighted to tell you about our program. And this program is organized by BKMS, Badan Keluarga Mahasiswa Sejarah Fakultas Ilmu Budaya UGM, and I'm Yulianti, will be chairing the session today. And to begin with, allow me to read out our program today. So the first one is opening, which we are conducting now, and then official speech by the Secretary of History Department, Dr. Abdul Wahid, and then the first speaker, that is book presentation by Dr. Farabi Fakih, and then proceeded with the second speaker, that is our discussion today, Professor Henk Schulte Nordholt, and then followed by the third speaker, our discussion, Ibu Amalinda savirani, PhD. So welcome to the screen of our BKMS Zoom and webinar today. And then to begin with, I would like to give the first opportunity to Dr. Wahid to give an official speech to our program today. For Mas Wahid, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Yuli. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Selamat siang semuanya. Good afternoon, Pak Henk. Good afternoon, Mas Abi. Good afternoon, Mbak Linda. It's such an honor for me to give a speech, opening speech, actually, on behalf of the department. And I think it is quite a moment when actually Mas Abi book just published last week, I guess, right? So it is quite moment. Why? Because I think Mas Farabi book is only the second books. Mas Farabi is the second one from UGM, or maybe even from Indonesia, whose book is published by KITLV, or now by Brill. So after Pak Sartono since 1960s, I guess, his dissertations published on the Peasant Revolt of Banten Peasant Revolt in 1888. And now one of our colleagues, Mas Farabi Fakih, his book is just also published by Brill and KITLV. So it is quite, we are very proud, of course, and we would like also to congratulate Mas Abi for that achievement. I think this is also our achievement as a department. So thank you so much for BKMS from student body of history department, which has taken initiative to organize these book discussions. And actually, it is my idea, to be honest, because the way I asked them to organize this. So I think a couple of days before the formal launching of the book by KITLV, I think it would be in 15th of October, I guess. So Pak Henk, thank you so much for your willingness to join our program. As always, Pak Henk is also always part of our department as a, well, old friend, is always there teaching us. I think several times he also become a guest lecturer in our department. Unfortunately, now we can only see each other through screen, but that's not really reducing the meaning of his presence, I guess. Also, of course, his thought on the book. I think Pak Henk, as an editor also for the series, will tell more about why he thought that Mas Abi's book must be published, should be published by KITLV, and maybe also the importance of the book to Indonesian historiography in general, or maybe international historiography on Indonesian studies. And also on behalf of the department, I would like to thank Ibu Dr. Linda Savirani from, I forgot, Linda, from which department? From sociology department. Oh, sorry, political science, pemerintahan ya. Also for being joining us today, also as a second discussant. I believe she will also can give more nuance and thought on the books, and of course I want to forget also to thank department BKMS, the student body of history department student who took this initiative. And yeah, on behalf of the department, we would like to thank to everyone for joining us today. I hope it will be a good start and also a good impetus to everyone. First, to read the books, because this is very important books, and we are just passing a very crucial week this week. Everyone just tried to commemorate this is the start of Orde Baru. Everyone thought that Orde Baru just started in the 1966 or 1965. But according to this book, the route it's much longer than that. It's actually it started earlier, and we can really see some connections and also some foundations for the authoritarian new orders state started earlier, actually during Sukarno era. So without further ado, I think just want to thank everyone and have a nice discussion, a fruitful discussions. And thank you so much on behalf of the department once again. And thank you, Yuli. I think that's for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdul Wahid, for a very nice welcoming speech. And then for now, I would like to invite Mas Farabi Fakih, but before that, before we proceed to book presentation, I would like to draw your attention to the chat box in your screen. And it is a live chat, and as you listen to the presentation, you can type in your question, and then we will be addressing them at the question and answer session at the end. The chat is being monitored by our colleague, the BKMS member, and then please don't forget also to mention to which speaker is your question being addressed to. And then, so for now, I would like to invite Dr. Farabi Fakih to present his book in the next 20 minutes. And for your information, the book, Authoritarian Modernization in Indonesia's Early Independence Period, 1950 to 1965, has just been published by Brill on the 27th of August 2020, and it is an open access, so you can download the book via the Brill, brill.com. And so for now, please, Mas Abi, to make your presentation. Time is yours.
Thank you so much, Yuli. I hope everyone can hear me. Well, first of all, saya akan berbicara dalam bahasa Inggris karena tadi kayaknya BKMS dulu nyuruh bahwa ini dalam bahasa Inggris. Tapi mungkin sebagai pembukanya saya pakai bahasa Indonesia. Saya pertama ingin berterima kasih dulu kepada BKMS karena telah bersusah payah memberikan forum ini pada saya dan pada kita semua. Saya juga ingin berterima kasih kepada Departemen Sejarah karena support selama ini yang telah mereka beri dan dan juga telah menjadi sangat krusial dalam memungkinkan adanya acara diskusi buku ini. Dan terakhir saya juga ingin beri terima kasih juga kepada Universitas Leiden dan kepada KITLV yang juga yang sangat sentral dalam memberikan kesempatan saya untuk penerbitan buku ini. Terima kasih banyak. My presentation, I want to share a screen. Okay. I hope everyone can see the screen. Okay,
Yes.
so my it's going to be a brief presentation. I will discuss about the main ideas of the book on the authoritarian modernization in Indonesia's early independence period. The book itself is the result of my dissertation, which I had conducted in Leiden University under Thomas Lindblad and Leonard Lucey. It's been somewhat modified, but to a large degree, the arguments have remained. Now, the background of the book is really the questions that have initially appeared when I started working on the book or on my dissertation. Well, initially, the major question was in understanding how exactly can Indonesia, with very few experts, very few people that had the requisite expertise, transition to a postmodern state. And in particular, how is it possible that the New Order developmental state grew out of the chaos of this transition period, which is the New Order, call it the Old Order. Now, New Order historiography puts the blame of the failure of the Old Order on the politicization of society as a result of liberal democracy and Sukarno's populist politics. So, looking at Indonesian historiography, the idea was that the New Order appeared to save the nation from the failures of Sukarno's politics and of the increasing politicization of society. So the book wants to look into how exactly that process played about. The book looks into the institutional and ideological development of this transition period, and it wants to understand how the New Order developmental state came about within both a national and a transnational context. So the main ideas of the book is there's several ideas that became sort of the main ideas of the book. The first is that we can see that the roots of the New Order developmental state was developed during this transitory period. So understanding the New Order state without understanding the development, especially during Sukarno's guided democracy, is not feasible. That Sukarno's revolution was a precursor, but also foundation for the changes that allowed for the developmental state. That's another idea. That the major tension of the revolution, of Sukarno's revolution, was exactly in what was called the position of the expert. So how do the new elites of the nation, the new experts of the nation, where is it located within the context of Sukarno's revolution? That the ideological basis for this was located in both the ideas developed within the experience of the nation, including ideas of Sukarno, Nasution, and others. And so while the ideological ideas, some of it came from outside Indonesia, it was very much an Indonesian located discussion. And many people contributed, including Sukarno, Nasution, and others. And that the rise of the managerial elite was composed of both civilian and military officers, but that it was legitimated through what was called a managerial ideology, which was cemented through American-dominated aid structure. So that's the transnational context, the rise of scientific management, not merely as a science, but actually as an ideology to integrate or to sort of place the experts within a particular position within Sukarnian revolution, but also to legitimize Sukarno's revolution. And that national planning and state-led development transcended Cold War ideologies. So this is also another important aspect or ideas of the book, that this wasn't really the ideological division within within Indonesia in the 50s reflected an international division which is not based on the Cold War. It's not really based on American-led capitalism versus Soviet Union-led communism, because in both those cases they promoted state-led development. So the difference, and there's a general support of moving away from liberalism. So those are the main ideas of the book. So I want to quote first of all Sukarno, which I have quoted in the book. I stressed this in my political manifesto speech about this. Oh, I can't see the whole about this the summing of the energy and passion of the people, because many of the people within the state apparatus, the people with noble qualities, do not understand the meaning of mass energy and mass passion. In fact, suffer from a phobia of the masses and the people. These noblemen and noblewomen must be cleansed and destroyed so that the revolution can continue as a people's revolution and thus reach an optimal level of efficiency. The question of the Sukarnian revolution and the question of the Sukarnian state has always been about the position of the experts and the position of the wider population within the context of state-led development. So this is the major issue. Do we go from a place in which popular participation is negated, as in the case of the New Order, or in a way that it allows for a way of, an institutionalized way to open up popular participation? And within the elites, especially the elite expert, there is a phobia of the masses. And this is something which Sukarno obviously in this quotation understood then. And so the question was then, how do we make the masses a way in which they can participate, but in a way that doesn't destroy, or that actually is efficient for development? So the rise of the experts, the management expert is central here. This sort of continues on Herbert Faith's idea of the division of elites between so-called administrators versus solidarity maker, and in this case, politicians like Sukarno versus experts or ahli. The rise of the managerial class, those of the ahli or the experts, are obviously directly related to the need for economic planning and development of Indonesia in the post-war period. Within the political class, there is a deep distrust against the nascent managerial class, especially from Sukarno. And I think this is understandable because the managerial class pose a threat to their position within the context of the newly independent state. So, in that idea, Sukarno wanted to manage their rise within the context of revolution, in which the managerial class was beholden to the political elite class. And so, in a way, his evolution wants to sort of manage a revolution that was both managerialist and populist at the same time. Now, another important aspect of the development of Sukarno's ideas on revolution was the development of military doctrines in the 50s. The changing position of the military, increasing control over the administration, especially after the 1957 martial law declaration. We've seen that throughout the 1950s, the military elite has bifurcated between the territorial and the special forces elites. The territorial doctrine fashioned within the Army Officer School, or the SESQUAD, emphasizing territorial control and management in a way that they tried to turn Army officers into managers. This is something that has been happening throughout the 50s. Now, in 1957, when martial law was declared and when Dutch-owned companies were nationalized, suddenly a significant shift of people from Army officers went into the managing of companies and of the state. At the same time, the doctrines that have developed within the context of territorial doctrine is very much focused on counterinsurgency approach which sort of reinterpreted various groups of society as potential enemies. And the army's anti-corruption push after 1957 martial law, that sort of made that sort of put into motion the role of the army within the Sukarno's Gadjah democracy state. Okay. I also look at the expansion of Indonesian higher education in the context of producing more experts. So, of course, the lack of educated personnel hampered development and economic planning. But this rise or this expansion of Indonesian higher education was very much helped through the relationship with international aid organization. And this introduced American ideas and education. You can see that Indonesianization was, to a large extent, or to a significant extent, in the 1950s, can be seen as a process of Americanization. And in that way, American modernization theory thus expanded into Indonesia. Yet American modernization management theories was not based on liberal ideologies. Instead, as I've touched earlier, it's really based on notions of state-led development. So in this case, Indonesian experts took over these theories and made it their own. Now, this is where I think the importance of scientific management is so central to Sukarno's revolution. As we've seen, the lack of managerial personnel was blamed for economic difficulty in the 1950s. So there were several economic plans that were hatched in the 50s, and none of it come to fruition. And oftentimes the root reason was explained as lack of managerial personnel. And so scientific management as an education was seen as a panacea. It was sold by the US through aid as a panacea that would automatically result in growth. But what's important in understanding scientific management is that as an ideology, it attacked the separation of power, trias politica. And so in a way, scientific management, especially in the way it was discussed in Indonesia in the 50s, and as it neared to the Gadjah democracy revolution, were made to support the ending of liberal democracy experiment. It was one in which supported the rise away from party democracy. Sukarno's Gadjah democracy revolution was thus very much couched within scientific management as a doctrine, but also as a knowledge system. Retooling and indoctrination, which were tools of scientific management, were then used in the effort to correct the defective Indonesian culture in the effort to produce a particular kind of Indonesian manager. So scientific management very much was part of Sukarno's revolution. Probably the main difference being that Sukarno did push for a much more populist approach, which was seen in the context of the 8-year overall development plan, which was quite interesting because of its participatory nature. So I quote Ernst Utrecht in his book Pengantar dalam Hukum Administrasi Negara, which is in Indonesian, but it's been translated to English. The granting of rights ermessen to the state administration meant that some of the power held by the parliament, by the legislative body, had been transferred to the hands of the government, the administration as the executive body. This is something that occurs in all welfare state as a logical consequence of the implementation of said welfare state. By expanding the power of the executive, the concept of the Gadjah democracy is born as the system of government of welfare state. So the root reason for the implementation of Gadjah democracy is development and the creation of a welfare state. And it supports the reduction of power of parliament and of the legislative body. And so this process in which scientific management supported the ideological foundation of Gadjah democracy will later on, of course, also become sort of the basis for the New Order state. Yes, I hope everyone can read this. So I also quote the head of the Lembaga Administrasi Negara, Dr. Prayudi Atmo Sudirjo, who was a public administration specialist. Anyway, the main idea of this quote is basically the same quote that I've taken from Utrecht, in that Atmo Sudirjo focus that we're leaving behind the law-based state and we are becoming an administrative state, in which the most modern government, whereby the state is seen to form a sort of corporation. So essentially, it's the same idea of a welfare state leaving democracy in the context of creation of welfare state in the concentration of development state. So another aspect which is discussed in the book is on national planning and the rise of the technocracy. So a new national planning scheme was crafted by Sukarno, but it was actually crafted in a way in which the planning was to be conducted not through experts but through the people. This was, of course, the creation of the 8-year overall development plan. This was Sukarno's initial effort of trying to expand Indonesian participation within a new developmental or welfare state. The failure of the plan, and the plan failed by the early 60s, actually resulted in a form of decentralization and in a form of increasing mandate given to experts again. So there was, so as we've seen then, the implementation of scientific management and the context of guided democracy had resulted in moving away from democracy. But under Sukarno's idea, it was going to be supplanted with a form of participation. And this participation would not require the parliament, right? So the writing of the 8-year overall development plan didn't require parliament. It required like participation of various golongan karyas directly in the process of planning. But the failure of the plan meant that there was a decentralization, and a new generation of Indonesian experts were sequestered into various research bodies and education centers where they met with military managers or where they met with civilian managers. So as we can see then, the development of Sukarno's ideas of guided democracy, the participatory part of it becomes less relevant as time goes on in the 60s. So, and that's an important component. So the significant shift away from democracy, which was supposed to be countered by an increasing form of participation through guided democracy, it never occurred, or it occurred only initially and then it failed. And as a result, then what you had was like the basic notion of the ideas which were then implemented under the new order. Sukarno's guided democracy revolution was thus in line with the managerial revolution, which was exported by American International Aid Organization. The guided democracy was a means through which the political class would integrate themselves as leader of the managerial state, and which, unfortunately, that really, at least within the context of Sukarno's political class, that failed. The position of experts became entrenched in a military-dominated managerial state during the guided democracy. The shift away from liberal democracy was a trans-ideological Cold War position, along with the rise of the ideas of state-led development. And thus, ultimately, Sukarno's revolution was the basis for the ideology of New Order's Pembangunan. So in order to sort of understand the shifts of this, it is not something intentionally, it's not something intentionally crafted by Sukarno, but he, along with the environment, with the transnational environment current in the 50s, sort of allowed that to develop within that kind of path-dependent areas. Okay, so thank you very much for that opportunity for me to explain a bit of the book. It's a bit, I think it would be easier if you can read through the book and But because there are quite a number of ideas there, but it's something which hopefully can help us in understanding better this period, which is an important period in Indonesian history, the 1950s and 1960s, and in understanding why the new order came as it did. Thank you very much. I give back to Yulianti.
Okay, thank you very much, Mas Abi, for very elaborate presentation and interesting explanation on your book. Dan waktu selanjutnya, I would like to give the next 20 minutes to our next speaker. That is Professor Henk Schulte Nordholt. He is an honorary fellow at KITLV and an emeritus professor of history at Leiden University. And his main fields of research include Southeast Asian history, contemporary politics in Indonesia, political violence, and the anthropology of colonialism. He has a special interest also in Balinese study. So please, for the next 20 minutes, time is yours, Pak Henk.
Thank you for inviting me to join this presentation. Traveling to Gadjah is unfortunately not possible, but meeting you in this way is the next best solution, I think. Let me at the start clarify my position a little bit. I'm one of the editors of the series in which this book is published. So I am not a neutral observer or a sort of objective discussant. No, instead, I'm very much an admirer of this book. So my talk is extremely subjective and deliberately so. I'm happy that the book is available in open access. It is freely accessible. And I think it deserves a very, very large audience. Now, perhaps you recognize this. Once in a while, you read a book that fundamentally changes your idea or your perception or your understanding of a topic of a period in time. For me, this is such a book. It changed my understanding of the 1950s. Abi clarified already a lot, which I will not repeat, but let me review briefly some stereotypes. There is the stereotype of the very positive image of the 1950s. The 1950s are marked as a new era of nation building, political mobilization, inviting people to participate and to face a promising future. As Ayub Rosidi once said when he was asked how in the 1950s the future looked like. And he answered, oh, the future was so bright and there was so much of it. Now, there is another side to it. There are more negative images. There's still someone talking. Can you mute your mic, please? Thank you. There's an influential article by Benedict Anderson. It's called Old State, New Society, in which he emphasized the similarities between the New Order and the late colonial period. In both periods, both periods were characterized by state dominance. And a sort of strange in-between period were the 1950s, a sort of intermezzo in which society, the nation, tended to dominate the state. So it was somehow totally disconnected. Earlier, and already mentioned by Abi, also in negative terms, is the book by Herb Feith about the decline of constitutional democracy. So 1950s were associated with the notion of decline. And that was very much accelerated and emphasized by official Indonesian historiography, national historiography, also influenced by the military, in which basically the 1950s were depicted as the road to disaster. Political chaos, economic disaster, and only the military could rescue Indonesia. That was the master narrative. Now here, Abi has a very different take and a very refreshing approach, I would say, because he provides, as he already said, a pre-history of the New Order. He sketches a pre-history of the New Order. And also, and that was the flash I got when I read his book, it finally helped me to understand how and also why the mass killings of 1965 could happen. I will come back to that later. Because in most studies, also of experts on 1965, the killings somehow suddenly happen. And they come, so to speak, out of the blue. For some, it is a sort of cultural approach where in terms of Javanese wayang stories where Durga emerges from the past and in the guise of killing squads starts to kill people in a sort of cultural rage. Abi provides a different storyline by explaining how during the 1950s, very gradually, a new managerial thinking developed. And it was also a developmentalist thinking that in the end, finally facilitated large-scale state-driven social engineering. The fact that it has been overlooked for so long is because the actual practice of this thinking in the 1950s was not extremely successful. But it was there. We see in the book the process starting, gaining momentum, so to speak. And that was a fundamental break with the colonial past, because the colonial state was, by its very essence, conservative, focused on repression, exploitation, anti-dynamic. Now, in the 1950s, on the other hand, states, also in the Netherlands and everywhere, take the lead in development, in societal development, in economic development. Also in the Netherlands, and it is an interesting, there's a new book, there's a new thesis also on the rise of Singapore, that one of the commissioners of economic development in the Netherlands, he was called Winsemius, became one of the main advisors of Lee Kuan Yew in applying the Dutch model of economic development and also societal and political development in Singapore. So it was a global phenomenon, and Indonesia was indeed part of that. In this respect, Abi traces the origin and rise of this new managerial class and also a new alliance of managers and military. Here they are as the new managers. And they were, for a large part, trained abroad. And they were also gradually convinced that not only economic development, but that social engineering, in a way of planning societal change, was thinkable and possible in order, for instance, to eliminate the Communist Party as a sort of illness, to cut it out, to to cut it out in order to pave the way for a new trajectory of state-led development. And not only, as Abi said, it was not only the PKI that was eliminated, but also civil society was deliberately paralyzed. So the killings of 65 were not this, as I said, the sudden eruption of a dark cultural force. They should be seen as a modernizing attempt to reset Indonesian society on its way to development. This is perfectly in line with the analysis of Zygmunt Bauman of the Holocaust in Germany during World War II. That was also seen as a kind of singular demonic event that was even located outside of history, and also seen in cultural terms, the dark side of Wagner, so to speak. But Zygmunt Bauman described the Holocaust as the dark side of modernity. Without modernity, the Holocaust was not possible. Without this new managerial thinking, the killings of 1965 would not have been possible. So that was the sudden enlightening experience when I had, when I read Abi's book. Here he changed my vision of the 1950s. So, because the 1950s and the New Order were not that disconnected as most historians have presumed so far. So 1965 was a horrible moment in time, but it was not the absolute watershed between the 50s and the New Order. There was a fluid continuity. Abi shows that the early 50s, the period of guided democracy, and the New Order were part of the same historical process that brought a new managerial class to power in the state. So in a way, Abi, you brought the 50s finally back into history in this larger process. As a result, democracy was undermined because it was seen as endangering the efficiency of social engineering. And the killings of 65 have now a history through which we can understand the dynamics of this horrible process. Because the top-down managerial thinking made mass killings first possible, made it thinkable first, and then made it possible. We should be grateful, very grateful to Abi for writing this very, very important book. It should be, I think, I'm convinced, it should be on the reading list of every serious course in modern history, wherever. And please help us, you, all of you. There are now about 158 participants. If one in each of you, maybe you have already done it, start to download the book, we may be able to break the records, the download records of Braille KITLV publishers, because this book deserves it. In doing so, I hope the book will contribute to a long and penetrating debates among Indonesian historians as well about the dynamics of their own past. Thank you very much. And thank you, Abi, for writing this book.
Thank you, Pak Henk, for a very detailed and interesting reaction to Abi's book, and also followed by encouragement to all of us to actually read the book and use the book as a reference for modern history in Indonesia. So that's highlight one of the most important presentation from Pak Henk. And also, again, I would like to mention, please download the book. It's just not for just to own it, but is to highlight the importance of the book in the history of modern Indonesia. And then for now, I would like to draw your attention to our next speakers. We would like to hear the reaction about the books from Ibu Amalinda Savirani, PhD. And she is the chairperson of the Department of Politics and Governance at UGM. And she got her PhD at the Amsterdam Institute of Social Research at Universiteit van Amsterdam. And then she also have a research interest includes the study of social movement in urban sectors and labor with a political economic approach. So for the next 20 minutes, I would like to give the time to Ibu Amalinda.
Terima kasih. Thank you Mbak Yulianti. Pak Henk, apa kabar? Senang sekali bisa bertemu di sini. Semoga sehat selalu Pak Henk. Pak Henk is my teacher during my master program in Universiteit van Amsterdam di Belanda 2002 dan sampai 2004. He's also member of my committee during my PhD, so it's very happy to meet you here Pak Henk, although virtually. Thank you so much BKMS and Department of History for the invitation in discussing Abi's book. I agree with Pak Henk with all of points that Pak Henk mentioned, how important this book is. I have 3 comments, but let me, before going to my comment, I'd like to first congratulate Abi. I remember discussing this baby ideas during your visit me in Amsterdam, or I visit you in Leiden, and it's so wonderful to see this all ideas, spread ideas consolidated in a book. Really, really excellent, and my congratulations to you. I perhaps mention points that Pak Henk already mentioned about how important this book is, how contributive this book is, particularly in the way we understand this period in the 50s. But as a political scientist myself, perhaps I will more highlight on the point of political perspective or political science perspective and draw some similarities, some studies which very much there are patterns from what Abi already arguing in the way this managerial class control and then become very important during the New Order, and particularly on the way the politics operate later on. The book is really contributing as well in the way we understand mostly with the different term of elites. Abi mentioned in chapter 2 on Bu Heather Sutherland books, also the teacher of Pak Henk, on the making of bureaucratic elites. That's also a very classic book discussing on how elites formation and how to what extent it affects or it relates to Javanese priai culture. Also very interesting book, very classic. It was published in 1979. Most of you haven't born yet, but I always think this is a very nice and important book to understand issues of elites and on the managerial, on the bureaucracy in Indonesia. Another book that reminds me when I read this book, it's also a book related to Pak Henk, a book written by Pak Henk's brother, Pak Nico Schulte Nordholt, translated into Indonesian by Sinar Harapan tahun in 1980s on the Ojo Dume. That's the title of the book. Something to do with leadership at the rural, but also mentioning on the role of the kacamatan, role of the bureaucracy in development in Indonesia. So when I read this book, I feel like this is a continuation of the previous classic book on bureaucracy and also the elites in bureaucracy. But Abi, I think, put another issues there, namely the knowledge, capacity, or the managerial aspect that become a very important capital. If Bu Heather Sutherland mentioned Javanese culture as a capital, which is very much cultural capital, and Pak Nico mentioned about this political capital in the sense of, you know, being a civil servant at the local level, kecamatan level. And I think IB contribution is on the way knowledge capital has become part of this managerial classes that he explored in the book, because he mentioned in many of the chapters about knowledge, specifically on the knowledge of public administration, on managerial revolution and all that. And the essence of this book that I think I find it really contributing is how this knowledge is consolidated in the level of bureaucracy and what Abi called as managerial. So that's really enlightening in a way, which to see the continuation from the previous classical book written by other authors before and what is Abi now, even though it's in a different time period. So, because I want to also clarify in I have some question for Abi. Despite from my admire of this on this book, to be honest, I'm quite unclear when the first time I see this. I read the title and I read the terms managerial. At first, I thought when I see it in chapter 1, it's actually about only the bureaucracy. But then later on, I read in the book, it's also about including the military. So perhaps maybe IB can also clarify, what do you refer, what's the scope of these managerial groups? If I understand correctly, in page 5, you mentioned that the argument of the book is on the development of the managerial class during 1950s and early 60s, resulted in the creation of both ideological and institutional basis for military-dominated managerial state during the New Order, I assume. So again, later on after I read the book, then I understand, oh, okay, the managerial group here referred to both the civilian and the military background, and they are become this one group, right? So this is also what makes it different from the other book and the previous book on this related topic, is how this is beyond specific sectors. I think Abi tried to identify the features of the similarities of feature about these two groups, the civilian and the military, which is basically they are one in terms of the way they consume, consolidate, and institutionalize knowledge, which become very much political tools in a way, right? That's make me quite curious, because the way you use the term managerial seems very much apolitical, whereas basically the knowledge itself are very much political when it is consolidated, right? It's become really a weapon from so-called the weak, because before the politician who are at the 1950s, it's very much the era of politician or the era of parties at the time, before Sukarno attempt to bury them all and make them non-exist, right? But somehow in the book, I just feel like, you know, you try to how do I say that, feature this group so much into this natural, how do I say that, natural, apolitical, and only doing the job, right? Which basically, I think the opposite, they are really consolidating through knowledge, consolidating their power, and then to use that as a weapon to attack or to, you know, this competition between politician and the expert has always been the case in Indonesian history until today, right? But it's very just interesting for me if you can elaborate why this managerial, that you use the term, because as you mentioned, the main core of the literature is very much this political and technical. And the second point that I very much like to hear from you is, why do you, about the title. The title is very interesting. Authoritarian modernization or modernism? Let me check. Authoritarian modernization, I think, right?
Yeah, modernization.
Yeah, if we talk about modernization in the third countries, third world on the south, global south, isn't it always authoritarian? Isn't it modernization always authoritarian? Is there any modernization which is not authoritarian? Because without being authoritarian, modernization will be very much not modernization, because the idea is that I will elaborate my second point. From the political science point of view, the idea of modernization in politics is very much about social order, right? social order, tertib politik, and a lot of book also translated from this political development, not just economic development, where you mentioned quite a good portion in your book, but also the political development. A lot of book translated from English, also from the American expert. People like you mentioned also his book, Samuel Huntington. But the idea is very much, what's this managerial for? I think it is for political order, and as you mentioned, to institutionalize the mass participations, which later on we heard, we understand that during the New Order, Ali Murtopo, for instance, have this very strong idea on state corporatizations, right? Which he adopts somehow in Latin America to really make sure that the participation of the people, of the citizen, will not repeat what happened in 1950s, where you just participate for the sake of participation, right? Participation should be in line of development and that kind of ideas, right? So, I mean, I just want to say that from the political science point of view, this it's very much the idea of Americanizations is very strong as well, and it is also very much used to disciplining citizen in the way they express their political participations. And public administration is another issues in this, is another field in this way to participate, to disciplining in the target of having this order, apa namanya, social order. So that again, the issues I think here, what quite contributive in your book is really the knowledge, how it is consolidated, how it is being accumulated and consolidated, and then later on used during the New Order, right? So that's my second point on the issues of institutionalization, that also very much how the from the side, the political sides is used to to control participations. But before I go to my third point, let me just get back to my first point. Apart from, I'm curious to hear from you, what do you mean by this managerial terms? I also feel like, as Pak Henk mentioned earlier, the 1950s is very kind of a critical moment in Indonesia as a country in post-independence. I wonder whether, are you actually referring to manager here as a national, at the national level, which this with these people of figures, Mitojo Hadikusumo, and all the figures that you mentioned in the book? Are you just referring to that? Because I also feel like in 1950s we have this conflict between national, center and regional, pusat dan daerah, right? A lot of going on between this PRRI, Permesta, and all that. And I assume there are also this managerial at the local level. Managerial at the local level, but it seems to me that it's not part of your attention, for your focus, because it's very much high profile at the national level. Also, it's actually about the, are you assuming that this managerial class is very much singular or plural? In a way, like, I mean, but the question is about singular and plural. It's very much related to this political economy approach, right? Which money, apart from how the resources are distributed among these managers, right?
Sorry, can you repeat I didn't hear like the last 2 minutes. There was no sound. Sorry.
I forgot what was the last one that I said. What was the last one that you heard?
The sound was, there was no sound, so I didn't hear anything in the last couple of minutes. Just 1 minute.
What was the last one that you heard? So I can check.
Mas Abi, unmute dulu Mas Abi.
It was on which level of managers?
Oh, yeah, because I was curious, but because in the 50s there's also this center regional conflict, right? And I assume it also involved the manager at the local level. And there, how to what extent they are different or similar with the one at the national level? And I assume that it was a chaotic time, so maybe there is not any connection yet, or I don't know. So again, is it the this manager class are plural or singular? That's basically my idea, because if you follow the way resources are distributed among the managerial members, like you mentioned that the USID, Ford Foundation, all contribute to the way knowledge is consolidated at Jakarta, right? So how does this resource are distributed? That can also explain whether it's a kind of plural or singular group in this managerial class. So I just want to make sure that I say it, so then I will not forget. The third point is very much on the way. I would like, because it's very interesting, and I'm kind of thinking, how can we relate what happened in the 1950s and what happened now? Because I find it really interesting the way Abi and all of us perhaps kind of divide this politics versus expert, politician with the legitimacy from the popular, from the citizens, right? Because politicians are elected through election. The legitimacy is political legitimacy, right? Whereas expert, they are not elected by the people, but their legitimacy is on the knowledge, right? So there's always this constant tension about these two groups, and it always happened throughout the Indonesian history. And when I reflect what it is today now, I have at least two notes. It seems to me that they are already kind of, how to say that, intersection between these two, because for what matters now for the politicians is to have a very sound economic growth, right? A very stable political political situations, but at the same time to have this legitimacy, to have this popular support from the people. So if you see this double, to have this, to be like Jokowi, for instance, you always need to have these two, being an expert and know what you're doing in terms of practicality or managerial, but also you cannot not have this popular support from the citizens. So in a way, it's also very much intertwined now, rather than separate, because what is need from the politician is actually now are both of them rather than one of them. And also I think during the Suharto, it operates differently, but actually quite the same. So again, we kind of it's very interesting to reflect that. Is it really always in constant tension, or is actually constant tension only in a certain aspect, but they are really intersection in another aspect, right? Especially during the election. That's the second that I want to reflect from reading your book and thinking about what is now. The second is, I think, these technocratizations, right? Technicalities and the focus on the administrative issues is not just become a specific ideas for the state. It also already traveled to civil society. If some of you, and even us in the because we are in the public sector, yeah, we know how difficult this during our research, for instance, so many papers of, I don't know, bukti pengeluaran, bukti this, bukti that, and there's just papers, and we have no idea what is it about. Is it controlling our activities as a lecturer, as a researcher, or what? It just doesn't make any sense. But I just want to say that this ideology of technocratization and detailed administration, it's also become an ideology for the donor, for instance, now to ask for the accountability. It's also part of accountability, good governance, and all that, right? So it's actually a kind of deepening more on this how administrative operate right now, in not just in the state level, but also in society level, showing how important this managerial aspect is, right? And it's become again become a political tools for everyone who want to control and who want to discipline anyone who, for instance, become a grantee of a donor or whatever, including us, the lecturer. So that's really perhaps my last point that I can say. Again, I will stop there, and again, Abi, selamat sudah terbit bukunya, sudah juga mendownload, sehingga mungkin mudah-mudahan bisa menjadi download tertinggi dalam sejarah KITLV dan BRIP. Terima kasih Mbak Yulianti, saya sampai situ. Selamat sore, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay. Thank you very much, Bu Amalinda, for a very elaborative reaction and also very critical. So I guess as Bu Amalinda has several questions to Mas Abi, before I give the floor to the audience, I would like to give Mas Abi an opportunity to react to several questions. I guess there are at least 3 questions that Bu Amalinda asked regarding to your books. So I would like to give the time to you to give the reaction or answer. Please, Mas Abi.
Thank you very much, Mbak Yuli. Yes, I appreciate, first of all, I want to say thank you to Henk for that very nice presentation and, that you've done. And I think very appreciative of what you've done so far to believe in the book. And to answer the questions of Linda, and please correct me if I mistaken what you meant or your questions. Yeah, so we have a bit of a dialogue. So the first on the question of what I meant by the scope of managerial within this book, because it involves both civilian and military managers. Yeah, so the idea is that managerial class that developed in the 50s was already a hybrid, one that includes both civilian and the military. So when for instance, the takeover of Dutch companies, a lot of it was then taken over by the military, the army officers. And then also in 1957, when after the martial law was proclaimed, the military expanded into various administrative posts throughout the country. And it actually, if you look at like the amount of military managers in the administration in 1965 under Sukarno, it was bigger than under Suharto afterwards. So it was very much a hybrid military managed civilian state. Now the discussion, I don't know if this is the idea of management as apolitical, the assumption, and I think this is a very important thing to point out, that the discussion on on managerial state is presented as an ahistorical need for development. But as I've shown in the discussion within the context of, for instance, trias politica, or the position of democracy in a welfare state, then this idea that scientific management was apolitical is nonsense. It's highly political, and it's very much integrated within the notions of American modernization theory, which wants to reduce participation, democratic participation, and focus on a much more streamlined control. So the idea. So what you see is that the welfare state and this military idea, for instance, of counterinsurgency, it actually melds together. So a lot of these ideas sort of affected one another. And yeah, so the question of what is political or apolitical, the importance of being apolitical is in the context that it provided legitimacy, right? This apoliticalness of expertise provides legitimacy for what is in effect a consolidation of power and reduction of political participation to a lot of Indonesian society. But Sukarno had a different idea. So this is where I think the interesting dynamic that occurred in the 50s, in that Sukarno, obviously he wasn't pro-democratic, but he had other ideas of participation. So it was really about the question of what extent do we streamline participation in a welfare state, in a democratic state. So I guess as a historian, my viewpoint is very focused on that period, right? So I don't really go all the way to the present, like, theoretical position and to posit because I think it's important for us to go through the historical process first, to understand why, for instance, this occurred that way. And I guess that's also related to one of your other question on the question of the title. Actually, the title of the book is not my original title. the original title would have been much more similar to my my dissertation, which would have been very apolitical, right? The rise of a managerial state. But it was actually suggested to me by David Henley, and I think the idea was actually to reduce that sort of apoliticalness of the that it isn't, that it is inherently a and it is then connected to sort of the new order, what do you call it, the new authoritarianism, that it has a lot of in its roots within the discussion of scientific management, which has this notion of being apolitical. Another question, I think, the level of, yes, the level of managers, yes, is very limited. And because there was, when I was doing my dissertation, there was two big ways I can go through this. I can go through like a really deeper cases of like going to the office, right? What's happening in these places? And I have to say that's much more difficult than just going to the bigger ideological discussion. That was actually, initially, that was my main idea, was to go through these kind of, but I thought it's an interesting notion of understanding much more, especially deeper in the context of, because a lot of these companies were already like, not bankrupt, they were zombie companies by the 60s. A lot of the companies that were taken over by, Dutch companies taken over by the Indonesian state or the military, they had hemorrhage, massive efficiency and so forth. And so it wasn't really good for, but so I realized that by going through like the day-to-day of managers at a more local level, the story itself is interesting, but it misses the point of the connection between this ideological notion and state shift. So it misses that bigger point of that's another, I think that would be a very interesting thing for someone else to do. It would be very interesting to understand what would happen in more localized context, and it's very challenging, I think, dissertation to write. Yeah, I think you can correct me. Your last question is to think about, is there something we can, in comparison to today, right? So in comparison to today and what's happening in the 50s, I think one of the major differences is that the 50s was so empty of expertise that any new production of a new generation of expertise would have significant impact on the elite. So it had a much more, somewhat like a zero-sum kind of position for politicians of the period. And whereas today, of course, Indonesia, the political parties have developed very well, and there's a strong relation with expertise and with various means, right? So I think that's because the state itself and its relationship with the people were so open at the 50s. There was no, and so the kind of shift, it would have been revolutionary either way. And I think that's why 50s was so much more explosive in that manner, because the effect of it would have been much more significant, just because Indonesia was a new state and because the amount of expertise or the elites was a very, very tiny amount of people. So as to what extent can we then think about it in the present context, there is a lot of similarities, but at the same time, the kind of historical juncture that happened in post-independence Indonesia, that was what's so interesting, what resulted in such a significant effect or results of the 50s and 60s. I think maybe was that all of the, probably we can discuss more on obviously it's not the end of the discussion. So thank you, Amalinda.
Makasih Abi responnya.
Okay, so Bu Amalinda, have you already gotten all your question answered by Mas Abi? Yeah. All right, good. So now probably we can go back to that again if Bu Amalinda still have some more question or reaction later. And then for now, because Pak Henk is has to leave at 4 o'clock, and then we have a question for Pak Henk and also Mas Farabi Fakih. So I would like now to give that question to Pak Henk and Mas Abi. So the question is from Abritzani Shafrullah. So the question goes, how did the effort of the army to take over the managerial of Dutch nationalized enterprises has a strong connection to build new order collectively or gotong royong? And then the second question is there a connection between the genocide of the communists as an effort to renew the concept of developmentalism by Sukarno? So please, maybe Pak Henk can react first, and then Mas Abi. Is Pak Henk still there? Can someone check? Oh, okay. So it seems like Pak Henk has already left. So I will get the question to Mas Abi. Please react to the question.
Thank you, Mbak Yulianti. Ini do I answer this in Indonesian or English?
I think you can answer in English and also in Bahasa, I guess, since Pak Henk is already not here anymore.
Oh, both, no? Yuli, can you run me again the question? Mungkin dalam bahasa Indonesia juga nggak apa-apa.
Okay, I will read the question in English because otherwise I have to think twice, yeah, and that will slow me down. So by Apritzani. So the question is, how did the effort of the army to take over the managerial of Dutch nationalized enterprises has a strong connection to build new order collectively or gotong royong? And then the second question is there a connection between the genocide of the communists as an effort to renew the concept of developmentalism by Sukarno? Okay,
I've seen the chat. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Mas Aprizani. So the first question is how did the effort of the army to take over the managerial position of the Dutch nationalist enterprise has a strong connection to build new order collectively or gotong royong? Well, I think maybe, I mean, there's an assumption here that new order development is based on gotong royong, right? And I don't think that's true. So I think the army takeover of Dutch nationalist enterprises, I don't think has a strong connection in building collective new order position. That's the first. The second one is there a connection between the genocide of the communists as an effort to renew the concept of developmentalism by Sukarno? Yeah, this is a difficult question to answer. I mean, first of all, Pak Henk's very interesting comment on seeing that, you know, the managerial state, the rise of the managerial ideology resulted in or makes understandable the killings of 65. That's very interesting. I would actually like to say that in my book, but I don't have the courage to do so because it's difficult to connect it. You know what I mean? As an historian, to like really connect how does that result in it. But I mean, yes, we can understand that the context of it is the one that's really interesting. Now, the concept of Sukarno is not developmentalism, of course. It's revolution, right? Now, Sukarno's idea of revolution is Nasakom, as we all know, right? It's based on Nasakom, so it's based on participation of various groups in society that Sukarno has deemed central to Indonesian society. So in that case, it would be it wouldn't work within the context of Sukarno's concept of developmentalism, because the genocide destroyed one of the pillars of Sukarno's Nasakom ideology. So unless I'm getting the question wrong, thank you very much, Mas Aprizani. Thank you, Mbak Yuli.
Okay. I hope that already answered the question of Mas Aprizani. And then I would like to go to the next question is by Pradipto Niwandoro. Niwandono, yeah. It's from Ilmu Sejarah Unair. The question is for Mas Abi. So, to what extent the emergence Indonesian managerial or technocratic class associated with American scientific management or anti-communism campaign, rather than a continuation from the old colonial state technocratic project during the ethical policy era?
Thank you very much, Mas Pradipto Niwandono. This is a very interesting question, actually. To what extent can we say that the kind of managerial or technocratic ideas was rooted more on either the present day Cold War American ideas of anti-communism, or whether we have lingering continuation of old colonial state technocratic project. I would say that there are two things that would so my argument would be that it would be associated much more with the Cold War instead of the old colonial state. And there's two things that I think strengthens that. The first is that in the context of scientific management, the discussions surrounding scientific management also include notions of what do you call that? The army counterinsurgency. That's also part of the discussion within the and in the context of the discussion in scientific management also connects it with discussions on the positions of democracy and the relationship with the state and society and the state. The old colonial state did not discuss these kind of issues. So the assumption of the old colonial state is that military control of the islands is already the precursor, which was created during the rise of the Netherlands Indies state, and so developmental ethical policy came through out of the control of military control. This is the other way around. The question of military control is the one that's being, bandied about. The question of whether Indonesia should become a democratic or not democratic. That's the one that grew the discussion within the context of the 50s. Another very important aspect is that the old colonial state's technocratic project, the ethical policy projects, was very limited in nature in changing traditional society. So it was always there was always a tension, because the old colonial state has a preservationist notion that traditional indigenous society has to be protected from capitalist penetration, right? That's a very central component of old colonial state developmentalism or technocratic project. Of course, they introduce education system, small credit, microcredits, all these kind of projects. But there's very importantly, it's very limited. Even by the end of the colonial period, only 2 million Indonesians have had education. Whereas in the post-colonial, the amount of the expansion of these kind of what do you call this? This kind of technocratic project, of the kind of developmentalist project, was enormous since the 1950s. And that's the second really major difference, is that the post-colonial state wanted to change society from the ground up. It was a much wider and larger developmental project, whereas the colonial state felt it had the obligation, the ethical obligation to make Indonesian society better, but in a way that preserved forms of traditional society. Because the idea of the colonial state was to preserve as much as possible the traditional society of the Indonesian. And the colonial state took upon themselves protecting traditional Indonesian society. So no, they did change. There was significant changes, but the change was very slow and it was very targeted. Whereas the kind of change that occurred in the just even right after independence was just this much more massive, much more participatory kind of. So the relationship between state and people, that changed significantly, and that translated differently in the way these technocratic projects were implemented during the 50s versus those during the colonial period. So I think that's my answer. Thank you, Mas Pradipto, Swanda.
Thank you, Mas Farabi Fakih, for responding to the question of Mas Pradipto Niwandono from Ilmu Sejarah UNAIR. And then we are already at 4 o'clock now. We're supposed to finish, but we still have at least one question now to give to Mas Farabi Fakih. Last question, I think, is from Mas Odi Dwi Cahyo. So he's from Ilmu Sejarah UGM 2011, and he is, as far as I know, he is now studying, taking his master in Universiteit Leiden. So hello, Mas Odi there. And his question is, I'm curious to know, and perhaps Dr. Farabi could elaborate one of his conclusions. The managerial state dominated by military. What made this situation possible? Thus, one of the consequences, the entire dynamics sentiment become the main tone of the regime, which inherited by the new order.
Yes.
So that's the question from Mas Odi.
Thank you very much, Mas Odi. Also a very interesting question, actually. This is really interesting because Sukarno had this idea of Nasakom, right?
Hmm.
So why did in the end he, the most significant portion that entered into the managerial state was the military, which then does allow for a military-dominated new order state later on. There are several answers, I think, to that. Maybe at least several clues as to why that would be the case. The first of all is that the military is actually one of the most the most modernized sector of the Indonesian state, in that it had access to higher education at the level that is much higher than most other places. So it was at the level military and the civilian elites, which were produced in the universities. Those were the two major sources for expert production. And also the military had strong relationship with outside institutions for education. Now, initially, of course, through schools, officer schools, but also later on, especially after 57, a lot of the military managers, they went to universities. Some of them got PhDs, and then of course within the context of the SESQUAD, very famously, of course, as we all know, is that they met a lot of economists from UI and other places, but also they met a lot of managers in the various management courses. So this idea of military versus civilian, it's actually much less clear in the end of the 50s, because you have military managers, you have civilian managers, you have administrators. They all went to the same schools. They were all going to the same management courses. And so I guess the bigger question is then, why not the communists? Why not the PKI, right? So that's probably the. So we do know that at the civilian level, a lot of civilians went through, and a lot of them were like sons and daughters of former elites. And then, of course, the military, which also a lot of them were former sons and daughters of feudal elites. And it was obvious where the course for which they could then rise to obtain education was clear, either from the military or from the civilian parts. But the question was, of course, why didn't Sukarno push for greater communist inclusion into management and managerial state level? And this is an interesting question. First of all, a lot of the PKI never really entered into administration, so they were very critical of it, but a lot of them worked from the sidelines of it. Especially at the elite level, very few of them participated into. And we have, there were communist economists like Runtu Rambi or who's that British lady? So there were, and people at the HSE, but very few of them really entered into. And then there were some within the economists who were a bit more leftist, or who studied in the Soviet Union or in Eastern Europe, but they also never really. Well, I guess maybe if 65 never happened, you would actually see more of these communist trained economists. So it might have been a process which suddenly was closed in 65. But another reason might be because the PKI itself positioned themselves as such. The PKI is weirdly not involved in the state, and this is quite interesting because all other communist regimes, so the BKMS was the third largest, as we all know, the third largest communist parties in the world. But the first and the second communist parties were all state managers, right? You have the Russians or the Soviet Unions, and you have the Chinese. Both of them control the state. The PKI is an oddly communist party that doesn't control the state. So it has a position almost similar to an NGO in that sense. And a lot of their effort, their effort in like managing people, they're all focused in developing non-state kind of approaches. And so there were, obviously there were some PKI that did enter into the state. Some PKI members did participate in writing or rewriting the DECON, the Deklarasi Ekonomi in the early 60s. But on the general level, the PKI has never really entered itself into the state, and so that was a major problem. I think another issue is that a lot of the PKI members didn't have access to the kind of education, higher education access that the military and other civilian groups had. So the PKI was very much sidelined in the context of the managerial state. They did try to enter it, but because of the kind of conditions that were present in the 50s, they were never present as strongly as they could have been, especially in the context of Sukarnian ideas of Nasakom, that it never really translates in that context. The Nasakom, so the PKI was never really integrated within the managerial state as other places, and so they became a major victim of it later on in 65. Thank you. I think that's my answer for Odi Jahil.
Okay, thank you, Mas Abi, and I hope that answer the question of Mas Odi. And then I said it was the last question, but I decided to give one more last question to Mas Abi. So I guess okay, this the last question is in Bahasa Indonesia, so it would be very also refreshing. So pertanyaannya adalah dari Mas Ferry yang sekarang ada di Hamburg University. Pertanyaannya adalah, saya ingin menanyakan mengenai social engineering dan modernity dengan relevansi kejadian 65 atau kemunculan rezim Orde Baru. Bagaimana hal itu bisa terjadi? atau skema teorinya sampai bisa mempengaruhi masyarakat, sampai ke pelosok-pelosok Indonesia. Sedangkan pada saat itu akses informasi sangat terbatas dan mungkin masyarakat Indonesia masih buta huruf. Value dari yang ditanyakan adalah value dari modernitas apa yang krusial untuk social engineering pada saat itu. Silakan Mas Abi.
Oke. Ya, terima kasih Mbak Yuli. Terima kasih kepada Mas Ferry Rahman dari Hamburg University. Oke, jadi kalau coba saya bacakan lagi pertanyaannya. Saya menanyakan mengenai social engineering dan modernity dengan relevansi kejadian 65 atau kemunculan rezim Orde Baru, bagaimana hal itu bisa terjadi. Well, so buku saya itu nanti adalah usaha untuk membangun. Ini ada satu hal yang saya nggak ngomong mengenai kejadian 65 sih dalam buku itu, ya. Tapi maksudnya yang ingin saya bangun adalah basis-basis ideologis dan basis-basis pengetahuan dan basis-basis dari institusional atau lembaga yang memungkinkan pembenaran terhadap pendekatan social engineering itu menjadi bagian erat dari pembangunan atau dari revolusinya Soekarno. Nah, itu yang itu diskusi di buku itu adalah mengenai itu. Terus bagaimana skema teorinya bisa mempengaruhi masyarakat sampai ke pelosok-pelosok Indonesia? Well, karena jadi banyak dari social engineering itu dilaksanakan oleh baik oleh negara atau baik oleh Kodam gitu ya. Jadi ada beragam kayak civic action, ada beragam kayak proyek-proyek besar yang dan aku harus katakan bahwa dalam hal ini banyak dari proyek-proyek itu di luar dari scope buku ini gitu. Ini kan kayak proyek besar mengenai pendidikan massal, proyek besar mengenai green revolution gitu ya, pertanian, proyek besar itu di luar scope buku ini, dan itu terjadi dalam konteks masing-masing, tapi yang memiliki kesamaan sebenarnya dengan apa yang terjadi masa kini gitu. Yaitu adanya kebutuhan untuk memperkenalkan atau mengimplementasikan serangkaian social engineering pada level besar gitu ke sebanyak mungkin masyarakat. Nah, apakah pertama-tama masyarakat Indonesia udah banyak yang tidak buta huruf pada waktu itu, karena salah satu keberhasilan besar dari negara kita di bagian awal kemerdekaan itu adalah pendidikan massal untuk menghilangkan buta huruf. Tapi jadi itu juga nggak relevan. Kenapa? Karena masyarakat di sini dianggap sebagai penerima dari proyek gitu. Jadi masyarakat itu bukan dalam konteks social engineering-nya yang dibayangkan oleh itu disalurkan kan, masyarakat disalurkan. Jadi masyarakat itu partisipasi agensinya itu dibatasi dalam konteks pembangunan itu gitu. So, value dari modernisasi apa yang krusial untuk social engineering pada saat itu? Well, untuk konteks managerial state, value utamanya itu adalah sebenarnya yang menurut saya paling penting itu adalah bahwa modernisasi itu membutuhkan proses pembatasan demokrasi, proses pembatasan dari posisi parlemen dan lain-lain tuh. Jadi modernisasi itu secara inherent itu mendukung tipe pemerintahan yang mana posisi dari kaum eksekutif itu jadi nomor satu gitu. Dan sekali lagi itu membangun suatu ide mengenai social engineering dari atas ya kan, bahwa semua proyek-proyek itu dilakukan dari expert dari atas. Ini sekali lagi itu bukan hal yang unik Indonesia itu, dan buku ini sebenarnya nggak ingin menempatkan kejadian Indonesia sebagai kejadian yang unik. Ini kejadian global yang terjadi di mana-mana seluruh dunia. Tapi mungkin untuk konteks saya dalam konteks sejarah Indonesia, bahwa cerita ini harus diceritakan dari sudut pandang Indonesia itu. Dan di situ dimana saya pikir mungkin dalam konteks mengapa buku ini mungkin berguna itu dari situ bahwa kita butuh suatu narasi untuk menempatkan di mana posisi modernisasi yang didorong oleh orang Indonesia dari sebenarnya suatu ide-ide yang sifatnya global, yang transnasional, yang memang bagian dari ide-ide perang dingin yang bukan lagi merupakan pertarungan antara demokrasi liberal versus komunis, ya kan? Tapi sebenarnya antara bentuk modernisasi seperti apa, karena komunis juga menawarkan bentuk modernisasi juga gitu. Dan sehingga proses ini mengapa pada akhirnya mungkin sudah inevitable Orde Baru itu muncul nih, ini diakibatkan oleh karena kondisi-kondisi yang khas di tahun 50-an 60-an, yang mana Indonesia itu bukan hal yang unik sebenarnya, tapi bagian dari proses-proses lebih besar yang ada pada level lebih global gitu. Ya, terima kasih banyak Mas Khalil Rahman. Mungkin kalau kayak malah menimbulkan pertanyaan, mungkin nanti bisa nanya langsung secara pribadi pada saya dan yang lain-lain yang telah telah nanya gitu. Terima kasih banyak, Yuli.
Oke, terima kasih Mas Farabi Fakih dan juga Mas Ferry. Itu tadi adalah pertanyaan terakhir, tapi sebenarnya masih banyak pertanyaan di kolom chat ya. Jadi mungkin karena ini juga recorded dan juga di YouTube, saya pikir kita bisa selalu kembali ke pertanyaan itu dan bisa berdiskusi langsung dengan Mas Farabi Fakih. Sebagai penutup, saya tidak ingin memberikan summary, hanya mungkin memberikan sedikit highlight tentang diskusi kita hari ini, yaitu tentang bukunya Book Presentation Authoritarian Modernization in Indonesia, Early Independence Period 1950-1965, yang ditulis oleh Mas Farabi Fakih. Jadi ada beberapa poin penting dalam bukunya yang saya pikir saya hanya ingin menyampaikannya secara briefly, yaitu bahwa buku ini membahas kenaikan dari negara pembangunan Indonesia pada zaman demokrasi terpimpin yang memiliki argumen utama sebagai akar dari teknokrasi militer Orde Baru yang dapat ditemukan dalam beragam perkembangan dan ide-ide semasa tahun 1950-an dan pertengahan awal tahun 1960-an. Dan selain itu juga membahas tentang kenaikan ideologi manajerialisme yang sangat penting untuk dapat memahami mengapa lembaga-lembaga dan ide-ide tertentu dapat berkembang dan seberapa penting peranan dari struktur bantuan internasional yang terbina setelah setelah dunia kedua ya. Jadi itu yang mungkin saya bisa highlight dari diskusi kita hari ini. Semoga tidak keliru dari highlight saya. Dan saya ingin mengucapkan terutama ucapan terima kasih kami pada Ibu Amalinda Savirani PhD dari yang sudah memberikan menyediakan waktunya untuk hadir dalam diskusi kita hari ini. Terima kasih banyak Ibu Amalinda. Dan kemudian juga terima kasih banyak untuk teman-teman yang sudah hadir di baik itu di Zoom yang masih ada 118 orang yang tetap berada di sana dan juga yang ada di YouTube. Mohon maaf mungkin kami tidak bisa mengambil pertanyaan dari YouTube, tapi seperti yang tadi saya sampaikan, pertanyaannya selalu bisa diberikan langsung kepada Mas Abi karena he is just around the corner here, so you always can contact him and he will welcome all the question. Jadi itu saja mungkin penutup dari saya dan mewakili teman-teman dari BKMS, Badan Keluarga Mahasiswa Sejarah dan Departemen Ilmu Sejarah Fakultas Ilmu Budaya UGM. Sekali lagi saya mengucapkan mengucapkan terima kasih dan kita akan bertemu lagi di acara diskusi berikutnya. Dan selamat sore, salam sejahtera untuk kita semuanya. Dadah.